There is a man sitting in a study inside a Georgian mansion on the Ohio River on the morning of January 9th, 1986, holding a decision he has spent years postponing and months making and the rest of his life regretting. The Christmas decorations are still up inside the house. The Ohio River is visible through the tall windows, flat and gray in the winter light, wide and indifferent to what is about to happen inside the house, on its bank. Barry Bingham Sr. is 80 years old. He has 5 children, 2 of whom are buried in Cave Hill Cemetery because of objects that should have been inert. He has spent nearly 50 years building one of the most admired newspapers in America, a paper that has stood against mobs and political machines and the comfortable consensus of Southern conservatism, and has not once changed an editorial position because someone threw a brick through its windows. He is about to sell it. He has 3 surviving children. One of them will call the decision a betrayal of everything he has given his life to protect. One of them has been waiting years, and in certain moods has been working deliberately for him to make it. One of them will call it a relief when it is done, which is the word people use when something they have been dreading has finally arrived and can at least be named rather than carried quietly. The name Bingham had meant something very specific in Louisville for 68 years. It meant that some things were not for sale. It meant that a newspaper was a public trust before it was a private asset, and that the obligations of that trust could not be subordinated to financial convenience or personal comfort or political pressure. It meant that the world required people willing to pay the cost of being right on matters where the comfortable choice was to say nothing and let someone else absorb the consequence. All of those things were genuinely true about the Bingham family and the institution they had built across 3 generations of remarkable men and 1 remarkable woman. The family had also built its fortune on a death that was never explained, suppressed a daughter for 50 years because the truth of her life was inconvenient to their preferred account of themselves, and ultimately destroyed its own institution in a dispute about who was allowed to have a voice in the rooms where decisions were made. Both descriptions belong to the same family and to the same dynasty and to the same 68 years of Louisville history. The question of which one is the more honest account of what the Binghams were has never been definitively answered, which is fitting because the Binghams themselves never answered it. To understand what happened on that January morning in 1986, and why the dynasty that ended on that morning carried the specific seeds of its own destruction from the very day it was founded, we have to go back to the very beginning, which begins, as this family's story always does, with a death that left more questions than it answered. Before we go further into this story, we would love to know where in the world you are watching from today. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. It genuinely makes a difference to hear from you, and we read everyone. If you are new here, please consider subscribing so you never miss a story like this one. Now, to understand what happened inside that mansion on the Ohio River, we have to go back more than a century, to a family with hunger in its blood and a talent for acquiring things that had belonged to other people. Robert Worth Bingham was born in November of 1871 in rural North Carolina into a family that had been educators and schoolmasters for 3 generations. A lineage of modest attainment and large expectation that pointed its sons toward classrooms and away from anything resembling real power or real money. His father was a Confederate veteran who wore his Confederate credentials into every room he entered for the rest of the 19th century, and the young Robert grew up steeped in the mythology of the lost cause, the specific and suffocating genteel poverty of post-war Southern families who had lost the material conditions of their former lives but had not yet released the social assumptions that had accompanied them. 3 generations of Bingham men had stood at the front of schoolrooms and called that standing enough. Robert Worth looked at that inheritance, looked at the world it offered him, and decided with a clarity and finality that would define everything he subsequently did that he wanted something else entirely. He had large aspirations, as those who later studied him consistently put it, and a personality constitutionally unsuited to small ambitions. He attended the University of North Carolina and the University of Virginia, without completing a degree at either institution, which tells you something about a man who was not the kind of person who stays somewhere once he has identified that somewhere as insufficient. He received his law degree from the University of Louisville in 1897, having moved to Kentucky in the years before. And the move to Kentucky was itself the first deliberate act of self-reinvention in a life that would be defined by them. He left North Carolina because North Carolina was his family's world, and he had already decided, with a certainty that was perhaps his most fundamental characteristic, that his family's world was not large enough to contain what he intended to become. His entrance into the larger world came in the form of Eleanor Miller, a beautiful young socialite from a wealthy Louisville family whom he met in 1894 while teaching Latin at the family school near Asheville, in the cool North Carolina mountains where the Millers spent their summers. She was, as his great-granddaughter Emily Bingham later described her, apparently a really delightful person who also had money. Bingham was immediately and by all available accounts genuinely smitten. He broke the news to his father that he planned to move to Kentucky and marry her. He packed his considerable ambitions and moved. The marriage in 1896 provided him with everything a young North Carolina schoolmaster's son with an appetite for the larger world could have hoped for. It gave him social standing in Louisville's professional class, a wife the city genuinely loved, a law practice that grew steadily through the years of their marriage, and eventually 3 children. Robert Worth Jr., Henrietta, and George Barry, who would later be known simply as Barry Sr. The world he had arrived in Kentucky determined to enter was beginning, carefully and on its own schedule, to receive him. He built his practice with the focused energy of a man who understood that every advancement was a brick in a structure he was constructing on ground that was not originally his. He was appointed Jefferson County Attorney. He was briefly named interim mayor of Louisville in 1907 after election fraud invalidated the previous result. A corruption-busting role that generated genuine civic credit and permanent enmity from the Democratic political machine he had exposed. He was appointed to the Jefferson Circuit Court in 1911, and the title of judge that came with that appointment stayed with him for the rest of his life. Through everything that followed, through every room he entered and every decision he made and every accusation that was leveled at him across the decades to come, he remained the judge, and the title conferred a dignity that the accusations could approach but never entirely dissolve. He and Eleanor built a house overlooking Cherokee Park. They moved through Louisville society with the confidence of people who had earned their position rather than simply inherited it, which is a specific kind of confidence, denser and more vigilant than the confidence of those who have never needed to earn anything, because it carries within it the memory of what it was like before. Eleanor died in April of 1913. She was a passenger in a car driven by her brother when the vehicle was struck by an interurban streetcar at O'Bannon Station in Louisville. The impact fractured her skull. She was taken to Norton Memorial Infirmary and never regained consciousness. She died the following morning. She was 42 years old. Barry, who was 7 at the time and had also been in the car, slightly injured, later recalled his mother pushing him off her lap immediately before the impact. The gesture, and what it implies about whether Eleanor saw what was coming and made a choice in the last available moment, was never examined publicly by the family. Eleanor's own father had died years earlier by jumping in front of a train at that same crossing. The Bingham family absorbed both facts in the manner that this kind of family absorbs most things that challenge its preferred account of itself, by declining to examine them closely and by not discussing them in any setting, where discussion might lead somewhere inconvenient. In the months following Eleanor's death, the judge rented a downtown theater near his law office and had the projectionist show him a home movie of Eleanor dancing at a party. He sat alone in the empty rows and watched the flickering image of his wife waltzing across the screen. He watched it over and over again, returning to the theater in the evenings, sitting with the light and the silence, and the woman he had married dancing in light that had already passed through its source. Those who knew him in this period described a man in genuine grief. Whether the grief was uncomplicated is a question that only the events of the following 3 years can begin to answer, and even then not definitively. What happened next would either confirm the worst things people were already saying about him, or give him, in the wreckage of a marriage he appears to have genuinely loved, exactly the opportunity he had spent his adult life working toward. 2 years after Eleanor died, the judge found himself reacquainted with a woman he had known slightly during his college years in North Carolina, a widow from a prominent family who had, in the intervening decades, become something the world had very rarely produced. Her name was Mary Lily Kenan. She had married Henry Morrison Flagler, the co-founder of Standard Oil and the man who built Florida's East Coast Railroad, its resort hotel empire, and the tourist economy of the Atlantic coast of Florida almost single-handedly. Flagler gave Mary Lily a check for $1 million and $3 million in bonds as a wedding present. When he died in 1913, the same year that Eleanor Miller died in Louisville, Flagler left Mary Lily an estate estimated at between $75 million and $100 million. She was, by nearly every accounting of the era, the wealthiest woman in America. She was also a widow in her late 40s, and she was lonely, and she had known Robert Worth Bingham in another life. When he was a young man at the University of North Carolina, and she was a young woman moving through the social circles of families who mattered in that part of the South, the judge pursued her. Her family opposed the match from the beginning and did so vigorously on grounds that were both principled and entirely practical. They argued that he was not a worthy suitor and that his interest was financial rather than personal, that a widowed Louisville judge of modest independent means with 3 children and a courthouse title was not an appropriate match for the wealthiest woman in America. He agreed, as a condition of proceeding to marriage at all, to sign a prenuptial agreement, waiving all claims to Mary Lily's fortune. The Kenan family found this concession insufficient, on the very reasonable theory that a man who agrees loudly and formally to want nothing from a very wealthy woman has often already identified exactly what he intends to take, and has simply chosen a route to it that does not pass through the obvious front door. They married in November of 1916 at the home of mutual friends in New York City. Mary Lily was 49 years old. Her new husband was 45. She had been the world's wealthiest widow for 3 years. He had been a widowed Louisville judge for the same 3 years, and whatever grief he had carried through those years, he had also been watching an opportunity take shape. Mary Lily's health deteriorated with unusual rapidity after the wedding. She declined in ways that the physicians attending her did not explain satisfactorily to those watching from outside the household, and the physicians themselves were an unusual choice. The doctors her husband engaged to treat her were specialists in pediatrics and dermatology rather than in cardiology, which was puzzling given that Mary Lily was documented to have a pre-existing heart condition and could afford the finest cardiac specialists available anywhere in the country. The treatment she received, the conditions in which she was kept, the decisions made about where she lived and what medications she was given, all of these would later be examined with a thoroughness that the judge clearly had not anticipated when he was making them. By the summer of 1917, she was visibly and seriously ill. On June 19th of that year, while reportedly in a dazed and significantly diminished condition, Mary Lily signed a secret handwritten codicil to her will. The codicil had been prepared not by any of the legal professionals who had handled Mary Lily's affairs independently, but by one of the judge's old college friends, a lawyer he brought in specifically for the purpose. The document was witnessed by a doctor who would later receive $50,000 for his participation. The codicil added a bequest of $5 million to Robert Worth Bingham to be absolutely his. 5 weeks after signing it, on July 27, 1917, Mary Lily Kenan Flagler Bingham was dead. She was 50 years old. The attending physicians attributed her death to myocarditis and edema of the brain. When news of the codicil reached Mary Lily's family, the Kenans responded with the fury of people who believed they were watching something obvious and had the resources to challenge it. They hired the William J. Burns International Detective Agency, at that time one of the most prominent investigative organizations in the country, to examine the circumstances of the death with the specific question of whether Robert Worth Bingham had played a role in it. What Burns and his investigators found raised questions that the family considered damning. Why had a woman who could afford the best medical care in the world been treated by a dermatologist and a pediatrician? Why had she been kept in the summer heat of Louisville rather than the cooler and more comfortable mansion available to her in New York? Why had the doctor who witnessed the codicil been paid so handsomely? Why had the codicil been a secret document rather than one prepared through the ordinary channels of estate management? In September of 1917, with armed guards stationed around the gravestone at Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, North Carolina, Mary Lily's body was exhumed. The work began in the afternoon, and the coffin was not raised until midnight. A team of physicians and pathologists conducted their examination in the cemetery lodge while darkness fell around them, and the armed guards stood at the perimeter. The results of that autopsy were never publicly released. They have remained in a sealed box in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, through every decade since, through every presidency and war and technological revolution and generational transition of the 108 years that have passed since the examination was conducted. The Kenan family launched a formal legal challenge against the codicil, pressed it with urgency and apparent determination, and then abruptly, inexplicably, and without any public explanation that has survived in the historical record, dropped it entirely. They accepted terms that have never been disclosed. They received their settlement. The sealed box stayed sealed. Robert Worth Bingham collected his $5 million. The rumors never stopped. Franklin Roosevelt, who received substantial financial backing from Bingham for his presidential campaigns through the 1930s, reportedly referred to him privately as his favorite murderer, and then confirmed him as United States ambassador to the court of St. James regardless, because the money and the newspaper and the political alignment were worth more than the rumors. Most mainstream historians have described the murder theory as impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, while acknowledging that the circumstances are genuinely suspicious, the questions genuinely unresolved, and the Kenan family's abrupt withdrawal from a legal challenge they had pursued so aggressively, one of the stranger unexplained decisions in the whole strange story. The most charitable interpretation, advanced by Barry Sr. himself in later years, was that Mary Lily was an alcoholic whose health had been compromised by years of heavy drinking long before the marriage. The most serious interpretation, advanced by the journalist David Leon Chandler in his 1987 book on the family, was that the judge orchestrated his wife's decline through a Confederate physician in order to secure the bequest and circumvent the prenuptial terms he had signed publicly and violated privately. What cannot be disputed by anyone examining the record with any rigor is what happened in the 10 days following Bingham's collection of the inheritance. On August 7, 1918, the front page of the Courier-Journal carried the announcement that the newspaper had changed ownership. Robert Worth Bingham had purchased controlling interest in the Louisville Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times from the Haldeman family for just under $1.5 million, a figure drawn directly from the $5 million that had arrived from Mary Lily's estate after the sealed settlement. He would acquire the remaining shares in 1920. The paper had been nationally respected before he arrived. What he built with it over the following 2 decades was something more consequential than respect, though the building did not begin without complication. He clashed immediately and genuinely with Henry Watterson, the legendary editor who had made the Courier-Journal a national institution and who had his own views about what the paper should be and who should determine it. The clash was irreconcilable. Watterson retired in 1919. Bingham took the editorial direction into his own hands and pointed the paper toward causes that the previous ownership had largely ignored. He used the newspapers through the 1920s to advocate for farm cooperatives, for investment in rural education, for the political reform that challenged the machine governance of Kentucky, and to build the democratic alliances that would eventually carry him to the most significant office of his life. He backed Franklin Roosevelt through the 1930s with both his newspapers and his personal fortune, and Roosevelt rewarded that investment with the ambassadorship to the Court of St. James in 1933. The judge served in London until 1937 as a vocal and consistent opponent of fascism and Nazism at a time when the Roosevelt administration was navigating the complexities of American isolationism and could not afford to be as direct. 700 British dignitaries attended a memorial service for him at Westminster Abbey following his death from Hodgkin's lymphoma at Johns Hopkins Hospital on December 18, 1937. Roosevelt sent his personal train car to transport the body back to Louisville for burial at Cave Hill Cemetery, beside his first wife, Eleanor Miller. The family he left behind was already carrying a weight the public record did not reflect, and one figure within that family had been carrying the heaviest portion of it for years. Henrietta Bingham, born on January 3, 1901, the judge's daughter from his marriage to Eleanor, had been 12 years old when she watched her mother die at the railroad crossing. Her father responded to Eleanor's death by making Henrietta his primary emotional companion in the years that followed, a dynamic that placed her in a role no child should occupy, and that bound her to him with a closeness that was never quite the closeness between a father and a daughter, but something more entangled and more demanding than that. She attended Smith College in the early 1920s, where she began an affair with her English composition instructor, a woman named Mina Kirstein, whose brother Lincoln would later found the New York City Ballet. The two women traveled to London together in 1922, and Henrietta arrived in England and immediately found herself in a world that was, in every way that mattered to her, more hospitable than the one she had left. She became, over the following years, one of very few Americans ever to penetrate the genuine inner circle of the Bloomsbury Group, that gathering of English intellectuals and artists organized around Virginia Woolf, her sister Vanessa Bell, the biographer Lytton Strachey, and their extended network of writers and painters and thinkers who had made the post-war years in London into one of the more remarkable concentrations of creative intelligence in the modern history of English culture. At a party one evening in 1923 in the studio of the painter Duncan Grant, the 22-year-old Henrietta mixed cocktails with a southern ease and generosity that her hosts found exotic and captivating, played the mandolin, and sang chain gang songs from Kentucky in a voice that multiple witnesses described as soft and low and faintly husky and profoundly affecting. The painter Dora Carrington, who was present that evening, wrote afterward that Henrietta had the eyes of a too wise little girl and described her as a Giotto Madonna. What followed between Carrington and Henrietta was an affair documented in letters that survived for decades in a trunk in the attic at the Bingham family home at Melcombe. Carrington writing to a close friend that their time together had produced in her something she had never previously experienced, an ecstasy that she described with an urgency and precision that made clear the experience had changed something permanent in her. Henrietta also came close to marrying the sculptor Stephen Tomlin, who loved her with a consistency that she could not or would not reciprocate with equivalent steadiness. She moved through the Bloomsbury world as both a participant and a catalyst, her Kentucky background and her extraordinary personal magnetism combining to make her one of the most discussed and most desired figures in a circle that was not easily impressed. Her father eventually called her home. The pattern repeated across nearly a decade, periods of genuine emotional and sexual freedom in Europe, followed by return to Louisville and submission to the demands of the judge, who had not yet come to terms with what his daughter actually was, and who fostered between himself and Henrietta an emotional dependency that served his needs considerably more than it served hers. When the judge died in 1937 and left the bulk of his estate to his son Barry, rather than to his daughter, the last structural support beneath Henrietta's life was removed without replacement. She was hospitalized repeatedly through the 1940s with what was described in the clinical language of the era as a combination of severe alcoholism and psychological instability. Physicians recommended a prefrontal lobotomy more than once, and it was refused more than once. She received electroconvulsive therapy under conditions her doctors described as arduous, the treatments requiring continuous sedation because her physical responses made the standard protocol unmanageable. She spent her final years in a New York apartment under the full-time supervision of a paid nurse, and she died there on June 17, 1968, at 67 years old, of a massive internal hemorrhage that was the final consequence of decades of physical deterioration. She was buried beside her father at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville. The family said almost nothing about her publicly. Her great-niece Emily Bingham, Barry Jr.'s daughter, spent years researching the trunk of letters and eventually published Henrietta's story in 2015 in a book called Irrepressible: The Jazz-Age Life of Henrietta Bingham. For the nearly 50 years between Henrietta's death and Emily's book, the family's ownership of the press that might have told that story had made the silence both possible and comfortable. When Sallie Bingham wrote in her memoir, 2 decades earlier, that owning the press meant owning which stories were told and which were buried, and that when the newspapers were sold, the private family papers stored in the building were removed before the new owners could examine them. She was describing something she had understood from watching what the family had done to her aunt's name and her aunt's life. The silence about Henrietta was not an oversight. It was a practice, and it had been in place for decades before Sallie gave it a name. The newspapers passed to Barry Sr. in 1937, and what he built with them over the following nearly 50 years was the answer to a question the Dynasty had been building toward since Judge Bingham made his first purchase. What does it look like when a family commits itself, fully and without reservation, to the idea that a regional newspaper can be a great American institution? Barry Bingham Sr. had been born on February 10, 1906, the youngest of the judge's 3 children by Eleanor Miller, and he was 7 years old when he watched his mother die. He grew up under his father's authority, graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1928, returned to Louisville to enter the family business at the bottom, beginning as a reporter and working through every rank from reporter to secretary to associate publisher to editor to president of the business in 1945, having taken full ownership following the judge's death. The decision to begin at the bottom, rather than at the position his ownership entitled him to occupy, was his own choice, and it gave him something his father had never possessed: a genuine knowledge of how the institution worked from the press room upward, a claim to the newspaper's identity that could not be dismissed as the claim of a man who had simply inherited the building. He married Mary Clifford Caperton of Richmond, Virginia, a Radcliffe graduate of the same year as his own Harvard graduation in 1931. It was, by every account that survived them, one of the most complete and self-contained partnerships in the social history of Louisville. Barry and Mary were devoted to each other with a consistency and depth that defined the entire household around them, which meant that their 5 children grew up in the specific loneliness of children who must compete for parental attention with 2 adults who have already found in each other everything they need from another person. The children were loved. They were also, in significant stretches of their childhoods, reared by servants, including a nurse the children called Nursey, who provided more sustained daily physical presence than their parents could offer given the demands of the newspapers and the civic obligations that Barry Sr. regarded as inseparable from what the Bingham name meant. Under Barry Sr.'s editorial direction, the Courier-Journal became what its predecessor ownership had only gestured toward and what its founding under Judge Bingham had made possible. Time magazine ranked it among the 10 best newspapers in America through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, alongside papers from New York, Chicago, and other cities with readerships many times the size of Louisville's. It received 6 Pulitzer Prizes during his ownership, including one for public service in 1967, which was given specifically in recognition of the paper's role in the civic life of a state that had not always been grateful for the attention. Barry Sr. directed the newspapers through decades of genuine editorial courage, support for civil rights in a state that greeted that support with hostility, advocacy for school desegregation that would eventually bring a mob to the building's front door, opposition to strip mining that earned the paper the permanent animosity of one of Kentucky's most powerful industries, and backing for labor unions and environmental protection at a time when both positions cost something real in terms of advertising relationships and social standing in Louisville. He went on active duty in the Naval Reserve in May of 1941, largely in response to the taunts of isolationist critics in Kentucky who had been challenging his editorials about American involvement in the war in Europe. He directed public relations for the Navy in Europe during the war years, received 2 Bronze Stars for his service, and returned to Louisville in 1945 to resume the publisher's role he had vacated for the duration. He served as chief of the Marshall Plan implementation in France from 1949 to 1950, was honored by the French government with the Commander of the Legion of Honor, and brought his family to Paris for the full year of his service there. He chaired the International Press Institute. He served on the Rockefeller Foundation board. He advised on the selection of Pulitzer Prizes. He served as a Berea College trustee for nearly 40 years, chairing the board from 1974 to 1975. He was, by every external measure the era made available, a figure of genuine civic achievement and genuine institutional purpose. The family seat was Melcombe, a Georgian mansion on roughly 40 acres of riverfront land, along the Ohio River in Glenview, Kentucky, east of Louisville, named for an English country house, once occupied by a distant ancestor, and purchased originally by the judge with money drawn from the inheritance that had arrived from the sealed settlement of Mary Lily's contested estate. Barry Sr. and Mary raised their 5 children there, in a world of servants and summer vacations in Chatham, Massachusetts, and European travel and private boarding schools, and the particular texture of a family that moves through its public life as an institution as much as a collection of people. The estate had an outdoor amphitheater where the family staged productions, a pool, formal gardens, a smaller cottage called the Little House. The children grew up with the Ohio River as their eastern horizon and the Bingham name as their inheritance, and the slowly accumulating awareness that their parents were devoted, above all, to each other and to the newspapers, and that the children were honored inhabitants of that world rather than its primary focus. What Barry Sr. also built, beneath the public record of prizes and liberal editorial positions and civic leadership, was a family structure that operated on assumptions he would have challenged, vigorously and without hesitation, in any institution his newspapers chose to examine. The women in the Bingham family held minority ownership stakes as a matter of assumed principle, never stated as policy but operating with all the force of policy. The daughters attended board meetings and were not expected to speak in ways that altered outcomes. The women employees in the lower ranks of the Bingham companies distributed mail and worked as secretaries, and served food in the company cafeteria, and cleaned the offices where the editorial decisions that changed Kentucky were made. The editorial page that called for justice in the public square was silent about the conditions under which the women who kept its own building running arrived each morning and left each evening. None of this was unusual for the era in which it was practiced, and none of it was inevitable, and the space between those two observations was where Sallie Bingham would eventually take her stand. None of what the Binghams had built was as secure as it looked from the outside, or even from the inside. The children of Barry and Mary Bingham grew up at Melcombe knowing they were heirs to something significant, and 2 of them died before they were old enough to receive what had been prepared for them. Robert Worth Bingham III, known simply as Worth, was born in 1932 and was identified from the earliest years of his life as the son the dynasty had been waiting for. He was charismatic, warm, and possessed of the specific temperament that institutional leadership requires, the ability to make people feel genuinely seen while also moving them in the direction the institution needs. He graduated from Harvard in 1954, served in the Navy, sharpened his journalism at papers in Minneapolis and San Francisco, served in the Courier-Journal's Washington bureau during the Kennedy administration, a posting that placed him at the center of the most consequential political moment in a generation, and returned to Louisville as assistant to the publisher. He was being prepared systematically and carefully for the role his family had organized its succession plan around. He married Joan Stevens in 1960 and had 2 children, and his position in the family hierarchy was so settled, so thoroughly assumed by everyone, including Worth himself, that the question of what would happen if he were not there had never been seriously considered. He was 34 years old when he loaded his family into a car on a July afternoon in 1966 for a vacation along the Massachusetts coast. A surfboard would not fit entirely inside the vehicle. He rolled down the windows and allowed the board to extend from both sides, an improvised solution to a logistical problem that seemed reasonable in the moment. While driving through a town, the end of the board caught on the edge of a parked car at the road's margin. It swung forward on the physics of an object that has found an unexpected fulcrum and struck Worth across the neck with a force that was immediate and final. He was killed before anyone in the car had time to understand what had happened. His wife and their newborn child were sitting beside him. Jonathan Worth Bingham was born in 1942, the second youngest of the 5 children, and was the one among them who felt most acutely the absence created by parents who were frequently elsewhere in body or in attention. He struggled academically in ways the family's structured world of Harvard expectations and newspaper succession did not accommodate well, and he eventually dropped out of Harvard at the end of his junior year in 1961, returning to Louisville without a degree and with the specific restlessness of a person who has failed at the thing his family assumed he would accomplish, and does not yet know what to do with the freedom that failure provides. On an evening in 1964, he was in an old barn on the Melcombe estate, stringing party lights for a reunion of his childhood Cub Scout troop, an act of nostalgic warmth toward the simpler world of his boyhood. He took a high-voltage electrical shock from the wiring. He was 22 years old. He was dead before he could be reached. His mother, Mary, was, by the accounts of everyone present in the days and weeks that followed, devastated in a way that did not diminish with time. and that those who knew her recognized as a wound that would not close. George Barry Bingham Jr. was born on September 23, 1933, the second son, and had spent his childhood in Worth's shadow, struggling with dyslexia that made the Bingham tradition of Harvard intellectual achievement more difficult than it appeared from outside, and with childhood obesity that made him self-conscious in ways he eventually overcame through the rigorous self-discipline he developed at boarding school. He graduated from Harvard in 1956 with a degree in history, served as a Marine platoon leader in Okinawa, worked as a television researcher at CBS and NBC in New York, and married Edith Wharton Stenstone Franchini, a widow with 2 sons from her previous marriage, who became part of the Bingham household. He had understood throughout his life that he was not the son his family had arranged its expectations around. After Worth's death, his father transferred the publisher's responsibilities to him within a week of the funeral. Barry Jr. acknowledged later that he had not been ready, and that refusing the inheritance would have prompted his father to consider selling the newspapers to someone outside the family. He had no genuine choice. He sat down in his brother's chair and picked up a newspaper that had won national prizes for decades, and he understood perhaps more precisely than anyone around him that the cost of keeping it at the level it had reached was going to be considerable, and that he was going to pay it. What Barry Jr. did with the newspaper over the following 15 years was distinguished in ways that those who opposed him never fully acknowledged, and those who admired him sometimes simplified into something cleaner than it actually was. He formally assumed the publisher's title from his father in 1971 and immediately began demonstrating the quality that would define his tenure and eventually fracture his family. He was a stickler for journalistic ethics in a manner that admitted no exceptions and recognized no special circumstances, not for financial pressures, not for social relationships, and not for the claims of family connection. He applied the same standard to everyone equally, which is either the definition of fairness or a refusal to acknowledge that equal application of a standard to people who are not equally situated produces unequal outcomes, depending on where you are standing when the standard is applied. Under his stewardship, the Courier-Journal won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, in 1976 for photography of court-ordered school busing and desegregation, images that captured the human reality of a policy that Louisville had not chosen and did not welcome. In 1978, for the investigation of the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in Southgate, Kentucky, which killed 165 people and revealed systematic failures of fire safety regulation. And in 1980 for international reporting on Cambodian refugees, work that took the paper's journalists to the far side of the world and documented a humanitarian catastrophe that American readers might otherwise have found easy to ignore. Each prize represented a specific act of institutional commitment, a decision to spend the resources and accept the risk that serious journalism requires when it is practiced seriously. When the desegregation busing coverage generated a mob of thousands outside the Courier-Journal building in 1975, people who found the paper's position on busing intolerable, throwing bricks and rocks through dozens of windows, while others gathered to demonstrate outside the front entrance, the editorial position did not change by a word. Barry Jr. wore a distinctive mustache throughout his tenure and favored Scottish tam o' shanter hats that his colleagues found eccentric and that he wore with the equanimity of a man who had long since stopped caring what people thought of his appearance. He was described by a prominent Louisville lawyer as someone who had never wanted to be one of the boys, and whom the boys had never wanted, which captures something true about both Barry Jr. and the boys in question. He was described at his funeral by the minister who knew him best as Don Quixote on horseback, heroic and dreaming the impossible dream, sometimes tilting at windmills, fighting for causes. He was, in the assessment of the people who worked for him most closely and honestly, a decent and serious man who had never fully wanted the life circumstance had placed him in, and who, having accepted that life, gave it everything he possessed. He also, applying his principle of consistent standards with a consistency that demonstrated both his integrity and his limitations, insisted on the removal from the company board of directors of his own wife, and of his mother, and of both his sisters. He framed these removals as the necessary application of a professional standard that could not make exceptions for family relationship. It would not be the last time his consistent application of a professional standard produced consequences he had not fully considered. By the time his sister Sallie returned to Louisville in 1977 after nearly 2 decades away, Barry Jr. had built something worth fighting over. And Sallie had spent 20 years developing precisely the language and the analytical framework for a fight he did not yet understand was coming and had not prepared himself to conduct. Sarah Montague Bingham, whom everyone called Sallie, was born on January 22, 1937, the eldest daughter of a family that had a very precise and settled understanding of what eldest daughters were for and a considerably less developed understanding of what to do when an eldest daughter looked at that understanding and decided it was inadequate. She grew up at Melcombe in a household shaped by the Southern version of inherited wealth and civic virtue that the Binghams had been refining for 3 generations. Her father read the classics to her during the years when the older boys were at boarding school, encouraged her writing with genuine warmth and genuine attention, and gave her the experience of being seen and taken seriously by the most important man in her world. What he did not give her, and what the experience of being seen and taken seriously made her eventually notice, was absent. Was any corresponding offer of institutional power or meaningful ownership stake in the institution his family had spent 3 generations building. He loved her mind. He did not propose to give her authority over anything that the mind was applied to. She graduated from Radcliffe College in 1958 and published her first novel through Houghton Mifflin in 1960, at 23 years old, a pace of achievement that established her as a writer of genuine seriousness before she was old enough to hold any meaningful position in the family company. She spent the next 17 years in New York, married 3 times and raised 3 sons, published short stories in the Atlantic Monthly, and had her work selected for Best American Short Stories, wrote plays that were produced off-Broadway and at regional theaters across the country, and built a literary career that her family acknowledged with the pride reserved for achievements that demonstrate distinction without threatening the existing arrangement of authority. She was not a dilettante. She was a serious and productive writer who had been working at her craft continuously for 2 decades before she returned to Louisville. And that sustained professional seriousness gave her tools for navigating institutional conflict that the family had not anticipated she would possess. She returned to Louisville in 1977, motivated by a combination of wanting to advance her playwriting career closer to its regional roots and a genuine desire to repair what distance had frayed in her family relationships. She joined the Courier-Journal staff as book page editor in 1981, a role in which she distinguished herself, and attended company board meetings for several years before taking up the staff position. What she observed from inside the institution was the distance between the newspaper's stated principles and its actual practice, a gap that she found first troubling, then increasingly intolerable, and finally impossible to remain silent about. The women in the lower ranks of the Bingham companies worked in positions that carried none of the public prestige the family name conferred, and none of the financial reward the company's profitability generated. They distributed mail and worked as secretaries and served food in the company cafeteria, and cleaned the offices where the decisions that changed Kentucky were made. The paper that had stood for the rights of the powerless in the public sphere had not applied that commitment to the conditions under which the women who kept its own building running arrived each morning. She began asking questions, pushing on the gap between stated values and institutional behavior in the way that a person who has spent 20 years taking their own judgment seriously pushes on things rather than waiting politely for permission to push. She eventually joined a political committee in violation of the company's own ethics rules, which Barry Jr. used as grounds for her removal from the board in 1983. When he removed her, he removed Eleanor at the same time. He removed his own wife. He removed Mary Bingham herself, the family's matriarch, the woman who had edited the book page and shaped the paper's civic identity for decades, and who had been present in the life of the institution longer than almost anyone else in the building. Barry Jr. framed the removals as the application of a professional standard that could not recognize family relationship as a basis for exception. Sallie experienced the removal as the specific and very old punishment administered to a woman who has asked the wrong questions in an institution that was not built to accommodate women asking questions at all. She was almost certainly right about what the removal signified. He was not wrong about the stated reasoning. Both of those things were simultaneously true, and the space between them was the specific fracture that would eventually bring the entire structure down. She demanded a buyout of her 15% shareholding at a price that reflected what the company was actually worth. She wanted fair market compensation for an asset she had no meaningful voice in governing, and the demand was not unreasonable on its merits, even if its timing and context made it feel, to Barry Jr. and to their parents, like an act of aggression against something they had given their lives to protect. Barry Jr. and her parents could not arrive at a figure that would satisfy Sallie without threatening the financial position of a company that was already navigating economic pressures it had not faced in its previous decades. Profit margins had slipped below industry standards. Circulation was declining as television competed more effectively for readers' time and attention. The newspaper had failed to appear on Time magazine's annual list of the 10 best American papers for the first time in decades. The company that had been worth building for 68 years was worth less than it had been, and agreeing to a buyout figure based on historical prestige rather than current financial reality would have strained resources that had no margin for straining. Sallie threatened to offer her shares on the open market to outside buyers. This was not a negotiating posture. It was a statement of what she was prepared to do if the family could not find a way to resolve the impasse on terms she considered fair. An outside buyer acquiring her 15% could become a disruptive presence in a company whose independence had always depended on remaining entirely within the family. Barry Sr. had told his children, in the years before any of this had become the crisis it had become, that if the company ever threatened their personal relationships with each other, he would sell it rather than allow the institution to destroy the family. He had believed, with what appears to have been genuine conviction, that the day would never arrive. He had been wrong about that, as he had been wrong about several things, and on January 9, 1986, he acknowledged it. Barry Bingham Sr. made his announcement on that morning, and it was the simplest part of what he had been carrying for months. He called it the hardest decision he had made in his entire life, and given the breadth of that life and the genuine weight of the decisions it had contained, the claim was not an exaggeration. The newspapers, both the morning Courier-Journal and the afternoon Louisville Times, would be sold. The television station, WHAS, would be sold. The radio stations would be sold. The Standard Gravure Printing Company, which produced Sunday magazine sections for the Courier-Journal and for dozens of other newspapers across the country, would be sold. Everything that constituted the Bingham media empire, the institution assembled from the money in the sealed settlement of Mary Lily's contested estate, built into national prominence by Barry Sr., across 5 decades of work and sacrifice and genuine courage, would pass into other hands before the year was out. Barry Jr. resigned on January 10th, the day after the announcement, and he made his resignation public. He called the decision a betrayal of the traditions and principles he had sought to perpetuate during his 15 years as publisher, and the word betrayal was chosen with the precision of a man who had spent his career thinking carefully about language. He had turned down previous overtures from buyers at moments when selling would have been financially rational. He had maintained the regional bureau network across Kentucky despite the expense, because he believed that depth of local coverage was what distinguished the Courier-Journal from a generic newspaper. He had presided over 3 Pulitzer Prizes and a newsroom whose standards he had protected with an almost religious consistency. He had done everything that a man in his position, with his inheritance and his values, was supposed to do, and a dispute about board seats and share buyouts had ended it in a week. Gannett Company purchased the Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times for $300 million, outbidding both the Washington Post and the Tribune Company, organizations that had submitted bids with the paper's journalistic reputation specifically in mind. West Television was sold to the Providence Journal. The radio stations went to Clear Channel Communications. Standard Gravure was sold to a separate buyer. The total realized across all properties was approximately $434 million. Barry Jr. and his wife received $45.6 million. Sallie received approximately $55.2 million. Eleanor received approximately $55.8 million. Worth's widow, Joan, and her children received $42.9 million. When a senior editor at the Courier-Journal learned of the sale, he reached for his copy of King Lear, the aging patriarch who has given his kingdom to his children and been destroyed by the act of giving it. The parallel was not subtle, and it was not wrong, and it had been noticed by the time the announcement reached the newsroom. The $1 million that Judge Bingham had invested in the newspapers in 1918, drawn from the $5 million that had arrived from the sealed and still unexplained settlement of Mary Lily's estate, had grown across 68 years of family stewardship into an enterprise worth $434 million. The name on the masthead changed. The building at 6th and Broadway in Louisville still stood. The people inside it still came to work in the morning and still produced a newspaper that arrived on doorsteps across Kentucky. But the 68-year agreement between a family and a city, the agreement that said some things were not for sale and that a regional newspaper could aspire to be a great American institution, had ended, and neither party could restore what had been there. When you lay the full history of the Bingham family end to end, a shape emerges that no individual chapter makes fully visible, and that shape is worth looking at carefully before the story closes. The dynasty was founded on a death that was never explained and an inheritance that was never cleanly accounted for. Eleanor Miller's death at the railroad crossing in 1913, possibly an accident, and carrying within it the possibility of something else, stripped the judge of his first wife and created the 3-year period during which he pursued and married and outlived Mary Lily Flagler. Mary Lily's death in 1917, the secret codicil, the sympathetic physicians who were not cardiac specialists, the sealed autopsy, the Kenan family's inexplicable withdrawal from a legal challenge they had pressed with apparent conviction, the $5 million collected and invested in newspapers within 10 days of settlement. These are the facts. They sit in the record without resolution. The sealed box in Chapel Hill has outlasted every person who knew what was inside it, and will likely outlast every person who still cares what was inside it. Whatever it contains has been sitting in North Carolina while the dynasty built on its silence, rose and fell and dispersed and became a chapter in American journalism history rather than a living institution. Wealth in the Bingham family traveled through women across every generation, and the women through whom it traveled paid various prices for the transit. Eleanor Miller provided the social platform that opened Louisville to a North Carolina schoolmaster's son, and died at a crossing where her own father had died before her. Mary Lily Flagler provided the capital that made everything else possible, and died in circumstances that the family preferred not to examine. Mary Caperton Bingham provided the moral architecture of her husband's public persona, editing the book page, shaping editorial decisions in ways the public record has never adequately credited to her, managing the household and the children and the civic presence through which the family's virtue was expressed to the world, and died mid-sentence at a banquet given in her honor at 90 years old, having made it to the last page of her prepared remarks before she stopped. Sallie, the one who named the arrangement for what it was, became the one held responsible for ending the dynasty, and she spent the remaining 39 years of her life contesting that description with the same stubbornness she had brought to every other position she had ever held. The family's sons died in accidents involving objects that should have been harmless. Jonathan at 22 in a barn on the estate where he had grown up, reaching for a wire. Worth at 34 by a surfboard on a vacation drive. An object extending from a car window on a summer afternoon. Robert Worth Bingham IV, Worth's grandson, born in March of 1966 in the same month his father was killed, growing up without a father who died when he was 3 months old, graduating from Brown University and Columbia University, working as a reporter in Cambodia, publishing a praised novel, founding a literary magazine in New York, dead in his apartment at 33 years old in November of 1999 of an apparent heroin overdose, 1 year younger than his father had been when the surfboard took him. The pattern does not require interpretation. It simply requires the willingness to look at it directly. The Pulitzer Prizes and Henrietta's 50 years of enforced silence were products of the same institutional assumptions operating at different levels of visibility. The civil rights editorials and the conditions in the company cafeteria reflected the same family applying its principles selectively to the spheres where application was costless, and withholding them from the sphere that was closest and most personal. The family built its fortune on a sealed document that has never been opened, built its reputation on editorial courage it genuinely possessed, and protected both by owning the institution that could have examined either one honestly. When Sallie wrote that owning the press meant owning which stories were told and which were buried, she was not making an accusation about her father's personal character, so much as identifying the specific mechanism by which a dynasty sustains itself across generations. You do not have to actively suppress the inconvenient truth. You simply have to own the institution that would have told it and decline to let it do so. Barry Bingham Sr. was genuinely excellent at what he built and genuinely unwilling to apply to the institution's internal arrangements the same standard he applied to its public positions. Those two things are not a simple contradiction. They are the portrait of a specific kind of man in a specific kind of American institution. A man whose understanding of what justice requires had a perimeter, and the perimeter ran, as perimeters tend to do, along the edges of what was personally convenient to him. The Binghams built their dynasty on that perimeter, and they lost it when someone inside the family decided the perimeter was not acceptable. The people who remained after January of 1986 were not left with nothing. They had their money and their foundations, and in some cases a grief that never entirely resolved itself, which is its own kind of tribute to the reality of what had been there. Barry Bingham Sr. lived for 2 more years after the sale, long enough to see what the decision had cost in human terms, and not quite long enough to reach any settled peace about it. He and Mary donated $2.6 million for the Louisville Falls Fountain in the Ohio River in 1988, a floating fountain visible from the banks of a city whose most significant newspaper they had sold 2 years before, one of his final acts of public generosity toward a community he had served for 5 decades. He died at his home in Louisville on August 15, 1988, at 82 years old. Mary Bingham outlived him by nearly 7 years, continuing the civic and philanthropic work that had defined her public role alongside her husband's more visible institutional presence. She had been the more formidable organizing intelligence of the family's private world for decades, and those who knew the family honestly understood that, even as the public record consistently attributed the achievement to the husband whose name it carried. On April 18, 1995, she was honored at a Rotary International banquet in Louisville. She had been invited to speak, and she had prepared her remarks with the care she brought to everything. She reached the last page and stopped speaking, and collapsed at the podium. Her son, Barry Jr., said she had apparently suffered a heart attack. She was 90 years old. She had made it to the last page of what she had prepared to say. It is difficult to imagine a more accurate portrait of how she had lived. Barry Jr. spent the 2 decades following the sale rising at 5:45 each morning to row his single scull along the Ohio River in the cheapest boat he could find, which was itself a statement about what he valued and what he did not, after $45.6 million had arrived and failed to change the essential arithmetic of who he was. He created Fine Line, a newsletter on journalistic ethics, and maintained it for years with the same stubborn fidelity he had brought to every institutional commitment he had made. He was publicly and consistently critical of Gannett's management of the newspaper, particularly its practice of running advertisements on the front page, a degradation of the form that he regarded as symptomatic of everything that chain ownership does to a paper that was built on the principle that journalism matters more than profit. He served on civic boards, refused most interviews, lived in Louisville, and died of respiratory failure on April 3, 2006, at 72 years old. He was survived by his wife and his daughters Emily and Molly, and by the conviction, which he carried until the end, that what had happened in January of 1986 had been a betrayal of something that deserved better. Sallie Bingham moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1991 and remained there until her death. She used a portion of her share of the sale to establish the Kentucky Foundation for Women, which supported women artists and writers in the state whose newspaper had once employed her in the role of book page editor. She founded Hopscotch House in 1987 as a retreat for women writers in eastern Jefferson County. She established the Sallie Bingham Center for Women's History and Culture at Duke University. She published her memoir Passion and Prejudice through Alfred A. Knopf in 1989, and the family disputed nearly everything significant in it. which is the predictable and entirely understandable response to a document that names what a family has agreed not to name. She continued writing novels, stories, plays, and poetry without interruption until the end of her life. She died on August 6, 2025, at 88 years old, of a stroke at her home in New Mexico, having been blamed for the dynasty's end since January of 1986, and having contested that blame, with evidence and with eloquence, for 39 years. Robert Worth Bingham IV, Worth's grandson, was born in March of 1966 and grew up without a father who had died when he was 3 months old. He graduated from Brown University in 1988 and received a Master of Fine Arts degree from Columbia University, worked as a reporter for the Cambodia Daily in Phnom Penh, published a novel called Lightning on the Sun that was widely praised, and co-founded Open City magazine in New York. He was found dead in his Manhattan loft on November 28, 1999, at 33 years old. A police source described an apparent heroin overdose. He was 1 year younger than his father had been when the surfboard killed him on the Massachusetts coast. He was buried in the same ground as the grandfather and the great-grandfather and all the others who had died before they could become what they were on their way to becoming. Emily Bingham and Molly Bingham, Barry Jr.'s daughters, arranged the transfer of the Courier-Journal's historic photographic collection to the University of Louisville, establishing the Barry Bingham Jr. Courier-Journal photo collection, a permanent archive of more than half a century of Louisville history. Emily published Irrepressible in 2015, and the family that had kept Henrietta quiet for 50 years finally allowed the daughter it had suppressed to be fully seen through the work of the granddaughter who understood that silence, even comfortable silence, is a form of harm. Melcombe, the Georgian mansion on the Ohio River where the Bingham children grew up in the particular loneliness of privilege and proximity to greatness, was eventually sold after the family dissolved around it. The newspapers that overlooked that river for 68 years are still published. They run advertisements on the front page. Barry Jr. is not here to object. The sealed box in Chapel Hill remains sealed. Whatever it contains has outlasted everyone who knew what was inside it, and it sits in North Carolina as the unresolved foundation of everything that was built above it. A reminder that dynasties do not always know, or always choose to know, what they are built on. What remains, after all of it, after the prizes and the mobs outside the building and the board meetings and the share disputes and the book page and the civil rights editorials and the busing photographs and the Cambodia reporting and the King Lear comparisons and the sealed boxes and the attic trunk full of letters from Dora Carrington, is the shape of what the Bingham family actually was. A family that genuinely made American journalism better for 68 years, and that genuinely could not manage the rights of the women within its own walls for the same 68 years. A family that built its fortune on a death it never explained and sustained its reputation on a silence it never voluntarily broke. A family in which the same assumptions that produced the Pulitzer Prizes also produced the conditions that destroyed the dynasty, and in which the woman who named those conditions clearly and refused to accept them is the one history holds responsible for the destruction. Both of those things are true. The question of whether they describe a great American institution or a great American failure may be the wrong question entirely. They describe the same American story, told from different distances, depending on where you are standing and what you have decided you are willing to see. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one waiting, families and fortunes and the specific ways that the things people build outlast the people who built them, and we would love to share them with you.